Hi, I'm Peter Gattrell from HCRI, also Department of History at the University of Manchester. It's my great pleasure to introduce two speakers. I'll first of all introduce Thea Hilhorst from Wageningen University in the Netherlands. She tells me that her new book is forthcoming with Routledge in 2013 entitled Disaster, Conflict and Society in Crisis, Everyday Politics of Crisis Response. She's also the author of books entitled Real World of NGOs and an article with a mouth-watering title, The Art of NGOing. Her title is on the PowerPoint presentation. She's going to speak for no more than 30 minutes. And over to you, Thea.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. And hello, everybody. Lovely to see so many people here in general and also so many people I know. It's quite a wonderful gathering. I want to talk with you about crisis and normality, getting our claim together. When I started preparing my slides, I first put sort of automatically getting our act together, and then I sort of changed it because I think our act very often is pretty much together, but what about our claim? That's more or less what this talk is about. Going back to the beginning, I will not go to humanitarianhistory.org or whatever, the whole thing, but just the battlefield of Solferino. That is where we locate the modern history of humanitarian aid. Of course, humanitarian aid in the sense of the desire to provide relief to people who are suffering is from all ages, all societies, all cultures, all communities. But sort of the modern setup of humanitarian assistance in its universal claim and in its institutionalized format around international humanitarian law, the ICRC and all that, that really can be located from the battlefield of Solferino. So we're all very familiar with it, the basics of humanitarian assistance, the principles, humanity, impartiality, neutrality, and independence, which I don't need to elaborate here. I'm pretty sure what they mean. Now, the thing, what's sort of the beginning of humanitarian assistance, the institutionalization of it, I think underlying it is an assumption of crisis, which actually, until today, sort of is triggered by this battlefield of Solferino. In a way, it's sorry, I will do it like this, I can see my notes better. So in a way, it's what I call here the battlefield conception of crisis, which sort of maintains that crises are carved out of normality. They're a state of exception. That's why I showed you the picture. You can actually see it. You have the surrounding hills, and there's one field. You can clearly see where it stops and where it starts, and that's where the armies meet. So it's geographically and spatially limited and manageable, this kind of crisis. And there is an institutional buildup that demarcates crisis from normality. What it means is that we are used to, and it's really ingrained in our system, both I think in our psychology and in our institutions, that there is a difference between crisis and normality, and we can tell what the difference is. We can see where the boundaries are, and we have two response modes, one for normality, one for crisis. Even in our normal day of life, everyday life, it's like that. When a friend phones you and says, sorry, I can't speak, I'm in a crisis, we know we don't need to expect any nice talks anymore. It's an acceptable excuse for being crisp and fast and don't mess with me. So the organization of crisis is based on sovereignty. Of course, supposedly in the world system as we have it, countries are responsible for their own crisis, of course, unless they're themselves part of the crisis, the government is in crisis, or there's an interstate war. And that is complemented by international assistance and international interventions. Of course, assistance and interventions, it's two sides of a coin. Interventions where we feel, okay, the government cannot do it or does not want to come up for its people. There is a lawful base for international intervention, and where governments ask for assistance, there is a basis for international assistance. Now, what happens when a crisis happens in every country, in every place in the world, at a small and a large scale, we sort of have a separate system of emergency powers. We have separate protocols for crisis from normality. We have actually separate institutions, and they can function differently in crisis. We secure resources when there is a crisis. Anything else goes, and we just focus and we single-handedly focus on the crisis at hand. Very important in the thinking about crisis is that politics has suspended. For example, in the Netherlands, it's very clear in the setup of our municipal system. We have politics, we have the municipal councillors, we have different party politics at the municipal level. But at the moment that there's a state of emergency, all mandates are concentrated in the mayor, who is unpolitical above parties. And there's no politics, it's literally suspended. We all know this, of course. This is all very basic. Well, my whole talk you all know. You could have done it all, I'm sure. So real crises are not like that. They are not as demarcated as the battlefield of Solferino. Sometimes, actually, they do fit the bill. And there are quite a few crises that we can handle. And we know that. There's a tremendous advances have been made in the handling of crises. We have quite a good system. And there's actually quite a lot of crises, either natural disasters or short-term conflict, that we manage to handle. We are always focusing on those we don't manage, but there's actually quite a lot of them that we do. But many real crises, and that's normally the ones that get more academic and political attention, are the crises that don't fit the bill. Interestingly, nowadays, it's a bit of a side, in the richest countries that used to have very neat institutions for crisis response versus normality, we see now increasingly that conviction is shaking up a bit in the rich countries. I'm putting here Katrina and Sandy as sort of examples, but also in the Netherlands, we now realize increasingly that due to climate change and what are we prepared for in crisis in the Netherlands is so small that even if something really happens in Schiphol, we're all lost because there can only so many ambulances can reach the airport. So in the Netherlands also there's an increasing realization that we are prepared for small crises, but not for the real big ones. Whereas the likelihood that they can happen is now sort of, we were always safely dreaming that the real floods couldn't happen anymore in the Netherlands, but now we're not so sure. So we see a lot of discussion on how crisis can actually be addressed when it is beyond what our crisis mechanisms are for. Also, in other parts of the world, in the fragilized states, I prefer to call them here, is that we see quite a lot of areas where insecurity has become a sort of permanent condition. So where the difference between crisis and normality is sort of gone, because crisis has become the normality. It is normal to have a crisis because we've had it for so many years. So people lose or never even had a sense of normality in these areas. Now, the real responses also don't fit the bill. As I said before, we have a thinking and we have organized. It's set into institutions that we have a separate set of institutions for crisis. But we all know that in reality, it doesn't work like that. We all know that in reality, the demarcations are not entirely respected. Even though there's a particular ministry that is being responsible to address a certain crisis, we immediately in practice other ministries coming up, claiming part of the crisis response and all that. Emergencies are immediately politicized. Politics cannot be suspended. And time boundaries of crisis, they are really, really unclear. And that's why also you see the response mechanisms sort of coinciding. While some agencies are still in the emergency modus and talking about humanitarian assistance pure sang, others already come in the same scene and are doing development work or also all kinds of far-reaching interventions with a future orientation beyond the crisis. Now this, again, this is all nothing new for you, because all our researchers, they point time and time again, have sort of shown these different realities on the ground as they are. So humanitarian crisis, we call it our arenas of multiple normative orders, multiple types of organizations, complex variety of intervention strategies. So if we look at the everyday practices of crisis, we see that this distinction and the way it doesn't hold is very much a reality of experiences of humanitarians, citizens, politicians, what have you. And I just put here 3 examples. One is Angola, where immediately after colonization there was a war. Well, there were actually 3 different wars, but they followed each other immediately, one after the other, lasting until 2002. Now, if you take there in consideration as well the sort of composition of the population, where I think 70% of the people is below 20 years old, you can easily see that there is just no sense of what a government can do, should do, what normality is in institutional way. What can you expect from your government, what not? What are your responsibilities as a citizen? People don't know. What happened in Angola, I think by and large, of course, stories, when you only have a few minutes, you have to make some shortcuts. I know there's more to the reality in Angola, but by and large, Angola was just abandoned. The international community said, okay, you have your oil, you can manage, you make yourself into a normal society on your own means and with your own resources. Another example I put here is Darfur and Chad. When the Darfurian refugees came to refugee camps in Chad, a challenge for the humanitarian community was that the morbidity and mortality figures within the camps were actually much better than outside of the camps. So the local resident population, well, not just resident, also sort of pastoral population, was in terms of indicators of morbidity and mortality worse off than the refugees, which were the victims that were in need of humanitarian assistance. In that particular crisis, the humanitarian community has chosen and opted to sort of broaden the scope beyond the borders of the named crisis and incorporate the local resident population as well in the humanitarian response. Another small example is Ethiopia, where after the major famine of 1984, which is pretty much branded in our memories, actually every single year, 5 to 10 million people survive on food aid. Not the whole year round, of course, but the hunger gap sort of varies between 3 months to 9 months, that 5 to 10 million people get food aid, either in cash or in kind, to survive. And there, what we see now is a rather audacious attempt to sort of combine emergency with normality, combine relief measures with development programs under what they call productive safety nets, where the international community with the government of Ethiopia secures families of 5 years of relief, welfare, to enable them to sort of escape poverty on a more structural basis. That's the way the program has been set up. Even there you see that crisis thinking is not abandoned, because this welfare system is not set up forever and ever. There is a final day to it, and there is still an assumption that in 2015, on account of this program, it is no longer necessary to provide food aid or relief, which by now, of course, the 2015 is getting quite close, is turning increasingly unrealistic. But it was important to trigger the motivation of the international community to buy into this program. What if we say, hey, we need this kind of programming in Ethiopia, not for the next 5 years, but maybe for the next 50. Will they still be motivated to chip in, to pay the welfare system in a country like Ethiopia? So I think at response level, on the ground, we see some major changes happening. There's this transition to cash relief, and there has been, that has trickled quite a bit for the last decade. But now it seems to get more and more important in the sense that WFP now officially claims that, or officially has an objective, that they want to have very quickly more than 50% in terms of their cash relief rather than in-kind relief, which is rather major. So it is becoming sort of the dominant response more than a sort of experiment in the corner of humanitarian aid, which is, of course, has a strong rationale in maintaining markets and other institutions. In other words, it has a rationale in trying to keep up with normality, even in times of crisis. Same with involving and building on local authorities, state and non-state, even working together with rebels if you must. Who owns the crisis? There's an increasing talk about that you cannot do crisis response in another country without involving the authorities. And again, of course, there's a rationale there to keep and maintain local institutions as much as possible. So to hold up normality even in times of crisis. The building up of local response capacities, we used to call it rather in a denigrating way, where now actually it was sort of us, the West, sort of building the capacities down there. But right now, actually, the talk of partners is getting more and more substantiated, and we see that new players also turn international. So we can't even speak anymore of the local responses. Very often these are international responses, but from another international arena. And even the donors break down the boundaries. For example, in the Netherlands, our Ministry of Foreign Affairs now has officially sort of taken out the boundary between humanitarian aid and development by putting it together in one division. We now have one division of humanitarian assistance and reconstruction and recovery. It's just one unit within the ministry. Now, in more theoretical terms, we've been trying to deal with this by this whole phenomena of normality, crisis, and how they sort of actually in reality intertwine by juxtaposing the idea of the humanitarian space, which is sort of stemming from the battlefield notion of crisis, into what we call the concept of the humanitarian arena. Now, I put here some of the parameters of difference in terms of thinking about this crisis and crisis response, which I will not deal all single-handedly with in the limitation of time, but I can go briefly through it because I'm pretty sure it resonates enough with you that even if I do it quickly, you will perfectly see where I'm standing. So the whole definition is different of the humanitarian space or arena. The humanitarian arena starts from the point of view of humanitarian actors. It's the operating environment for humanitarian action where humanitarians work according to their principles. Whereas in the humanitarian arena perspective, you say it is an arena where actors socially negotiate the policies and practices of aid. It's a different way of describing that arena or the humanitarian operational field. The scope, the whole discussion about humanitarian assistance is often limited to humanitarian aid, whereas there are so many different kinds of service providers in this humanitarian crisis that operate, and how do they operate together against each other? What is happening? The crisis itself, is it separated from normality, or do you acknowledge continuities and discontinuities between crisis and normality from the start? Actors, as I say, the humanitarian space model is very humanitarian agency focused, centered. Whereas in reality, in an arena, if you take the arena perspective, you say there are no a priori distinctions between the deliverers of services. In Angola, the humanitarian aid agencies were perhaps minor for people on the ground because they received more assistance from their churches than from the humanitarian aid. In some parts of the country, they also received more assistance from the government than from the humanitarian actors. So in an arena perspective, you try to see who are the different actors, how do they work, not work upon each other. In terms of the principles, we have the humanitarian space, the idea of the humanitarian principles that you try to impose on reality as much as you can. You try to implement them as much as you can. Whereas in the humanitarian arena, we analyze principles slightly different, more as negotiated and as emerging. And not necessarily just from the humanitarian principles, but there can be others too, in terms of, for example, solidarity, or the principle of friendship, or whatever other principle you may have, or rights-based. Local institutions, in traditional ways of thinking, why do we have these international humanitarian actors and why do we need them? It is, of course, also because we consider local institutions per definition as part of the problem. So you will not help work with them. I'm not talking reality, yeah? I'm really sort of juxtaposing two models. So both models are not true. But it's a way of helping us to think through the reality on the ground. So the local institutions, they were either spoilers and causes of crisis, or they are portrayed as being in need. They lack something. They don't have the capacities. We have to build them. Whereas in an arena perspective, we actually look at those local institutions as social actors that have their own interests, and they have different stakes in crisis. They can be stakes for survival, but also for peace and for conflict. You can't tell beforehand. You cannot just label local institutions before you actually know them. International humanitarians in the humanitarian space is that they are driven by their principles, although every evaluation tells that they deviate in practice. In an arena perspective, also the humanitarians, they are not just driven by one thing, their principles. They're also driven by the organizational politics. And those organizational politics, we all know, are pretty nasty at times in the humanitarian arena. Aid recipients, social actors, they seek survival, co-shape the realities of aid delivery. They are not just victims, cheats, what have you. And the time frame, as I said, can be very different. Now we get to the so what question, because so far I've basically told you that real crises don't fit the assumptions, real responses don't fit the assumptions, and I hope to have convinced you in the last two sheets, we actually have a model to describe and explain the emerging realities. So what's the problem? We can perhaps just simply drop the assumptions and then nothing is left, and we have no problem. But that is not entirely what I want to tell you. And I have two concerns that I still want to bring to the table. And that is, my first concern is about, it's probably not English, the deprincipalization of aid. So what I say here is when we recognize that real response is always political, does not mean that upholding principles of neutrality and impartiality is not important. And they are and continue to be important as parameters of discussion and humanitarian diplomacy. I just had a meeting with volunteers from the Syrian Red Crescent, and it was just moving, deeply moving to hear those people that risk their lives every night sitting on an ambulance, trying to negotiate their way to get to people they want to help, using arguments that are directly coming from the humanitarian principles, and sometimes managing to convince people at the roadblocks that they actually go there just to help victims and not to do something else. Now, if you compare this with the discussion around human rights, I think what my uncomfortable feeling sometimes that we just would throw away principles simply because they don't work, can compare to the discussion around human rights, where we have, of course, this discussion for decades. Human rights are unattained and are unattainable to a very large extent. There's also the accusation that they are Western-oriented and all that, yet for many people, and it is for many people without doubt, that they are extremely precious to have that normative framework of human rights. And until today, people continue even to die for them, so important they find them. So the deprincipalization of aid is a concern. And what do we do with the principles in the final, what do we finally do with them? My other concern is the de-exception, I'm almost done, Peter. My other concern is the de-exceptionalization or the normalization of crisis. The relief of human suffering in and of itself, as formulated by Henri Dunant, is of course a very modest principle. Henri Dunant was not a revolutionary or something, eh? I mean, he just came a few years ahead of Karl Marx, who wanted to throw over the whole system, but Dunant just simply said, okay, everything is fine as long as we relieve the real life-threatening suffering. It was in a way a modest claim, but even that claim today, if we normalize crisis, aren't we also sort of making the conditions of crisis becoming acceptable or natural? And here I want to make another sideway to another debate about securitization. Securitization in political terms means that you declare a crisis and you make it so important that everything else has to go. And the primary example, of course, is the war on terror, which was labeled as sort of more important, more urgent than anything else. So all resources, all politics were concentrated on that particular problem and the particular solution that came with it. Now, of course, there's lots has been written about the difficulty with securitization and the dangers and the way it's being imposed on peoples and all that. At the same time, we have to realize that securitization also is a means to secure resources and political will. And in some areas, you could actually be afraid for the opposite. The desecuritization can also mean that we just don't have the energy or the will anymore to muster resources to solve problems. So for me, and this is my final sheet, the key challenge I want to put in front of you, and I hope we can still have some time to discuss it, and it's that we, on the one hand, we recognize and respond to the normalization of crisis because it is an empirical reality, and it is going to become a more empirical reality if we listen and see what is happening in terms of climate change, without resorting what I would call the politics of abandonment. When you desecuritize a problem, when you don't make it a crisis, when you say, okay, we will not now jump into our crisis modus and it's an exception and we have to do something, the whole world has to unite, there could be many advantages to that, but at the same time you risk that you end up in a politics of abandonment where you say, well, that's just Africa. That's where they suffer every year. They are hungry every year. Why would we still try to get the television, the humanitarians to get together and secure resources for it? And it's real. I don't know the countries in which you live, but definitely in the Netherlands last year that was becoming an acceptable discussion to say it out loud that because hunger is happening every year, we don't need to care anymore. So the key challenge is, for me, to recognize and respond to the normalization of crisis without resorting to politics of abandonment. And therefore, it is quite a challenge to uphold the principle of humanity and to be ready to give relief to people who are really suffering. Thank you.
There will, of course, be a chance for a few minutes of comments, questions and answers after Michael has spoken. But next speaker up is Michael Barnett from George Washington University, well known to many in this room, and the author most recently of a book that's sure to become a classic, Empire of Humanity. Michael's going to speak for around half an hour.
We'll see.
Maximum.
Exactly.
Maximum, thanks.
Very, very aware that I'm standing between you and lunch, which is always a dangerous situation. You all become deeply uncivilized. It's terrific to be here. It's great to be at something that Bertrand has organized. And people ask me about the storm. Surprised I turned up. Everything was fine in D.C., but the storm in D.C. actually was the election. We had an election in the United States this past week, and it was, I don't actually have a chance to interact very often with Romney supporters, and so I felt okay doing so, though, because my side won. I feel okay display my partisan politics there. Obama won, Romney lost, and so I thought I could go look into the losing side's locker room and see what was going on. And I turned on, and where do you go? You turn on Fox News in the United States. If you want to go into the losing side's locker room, then you go to Fox News, and there was, and I think I heard something that, they were, I don't know how to describe them, but, there were a bunch of, I just say very, very white people who were lamenting the fact not that their candidate lost, but that they were losing America. Because the problem was, as you looked at the exit polls, it was pretty clear that what carried Obama to victory were a set of coalitions, women, African Americans, and importantly, Hispanics. These were incredibly important for the turnout, and this actually was decisive for leading Obama to victory. And you could just see the horror in the eyes of the people who were on Fox News, because they thought America was over as they knew it, and they were quite concerned. And in a moment, though, I'm watching Bill O'Reilly, who's one of the chief patron saints of the right. I had this flashback, though, to several meetings I've attended over the last several years in sort of groups like this, talking about the future of humanitarianism. And at these meetings, there are representatives of people that I guess Alex DeWall would have called the Humanitarian International. There aren't any Marxists anymore that I can tell, and so I just simply prefer to call them members of the Humanitarian Club. And they can be likened to a club. In various kinds of ways. They all come from, in many ways, similar institutions. They've all interacted educationally in similar kinds of ways. Their networks are rather similar. They know each other reasonably well. They're all from the same Western donors, the Western-based, Western-backed international organizations, and Western-based NGOs. Like all clubs, there are rivalries, there's petty fights, there's infighting, there's innuendo. But by and large, there's still something that unifies them as the members of the club. And there's something been a little bit unusual about the members of the club these days, in that they looked a lot like Fox News, as I was sort of reflecting. And the reason is because they were also, in many ways, speaking of a time that seemed to be passing and looking into the future and not really sure where they sat. And by that I mean they were, like those in Fox News and like Bill O'Reilly, were seeing that the world was changing, that there were new members that were coming in, that the club was becoming more diverse, and they weren't sure if the same rules applied. And the consequence was, and this is with a lot of violence to analogizing, there was, I think, a fair bit of anxiety that seemed to me to be the same kind of anxiety I was seeing the other day coming out of Fox News. And that anxiety was one that the world is changing, there's a pluralization of actors, there's a fragmentation of authority, and there's a decline of legitimacy. And this is something that we need to worry about. And the source of anxiety, I think, and I'm going to use the period just to speculate and pose some questions. I have no firm evidence and certainly no answers. The source of anxiety, I think, is the growing unease that humanitarianism might not be able to survive its internationalization, which is itself something of an ironic development, because humanitarianism always saw itself as global, both in terms of geography, it had a global reach, and in terms of ethics, because humanitarianism was part of a universal set of ethics, even though it was culturally located in the West. But if I'm right about what I'm sensing from my friends in the Humanitarian Club, it's that they're anxious because globalization, internationalization, I'll use these terms interchangeably, is nibbling at its universalist claims, which suggests that perhaps it was never as universalist as it presented itself to be. So my question then, and I pose this as a question, I have no answers, is to what extent can humanitarianism survive this new age of internationalization and universalization? Can it survive? In order to develop this argument briefly, what I want to simply do is take a very much a bird's eye view and look at what I would just simply, and for the sake of simplicity, sketch as two phases in the internationalization of humanitarianism. And that first phase begins back, as everybody knows, back in the beginning. In the beginning, this is the kind of lore now that we tell each other, that in the beginning we're looking at the late 18th century, beginning through in the early 19th century, and then with that iconic moment of Solferino. And what's significant about this history is that they're locating a set of forces, drivers, that are by and large located in the West. And this has, and it's true in terms of those major elements we use to think about the sweep of history, and that's in terms of the culture, geopolitics, economics, and technology. If you look at, for instance, some of the more recent, I think, very impressive contributions to the emergence of humanitarianism from a cultural move, and here I'm thinking of the work of Andrew Linklater, whose work on the problem of harm I think is really quite insightful and interesting, and I don't think it's gotten quite the attention it deserves. Or Steven Pinker, a book that has gotten a lot more attention. What you see in both of those arguments is a claim of civilizing processes that are located in the West and that gradually kind of expand outward. And if, in fact, the civilizing processes are working, what you have then is a corresponding spread of a humanitarian sensibility. And so the hero of the story, in many ways, is the West. And they're very careful not to say that humanitarianism is owned and operated by the West, that the kind of sentiments and principles that one sees in humanitarianism are only Western or culturally specific. But it's also very clear empirically in their narrative of history that these are forces that are emanating from the West. This is also true in terms of the spread of humanitarianism in terms of geopolitical change, whether it's about civilizing missions or imperial rule, new kinds of security dynamics and challenges, or more recently in the kind of thing that Antonio Donini has edited on its instrumentalization. Again, there is a sense in which then in its glory, much of what humanitarianism has been hooked to is a geopolitics and a set of strategic thoughts. There's economic change that, again, is located in the West. If you want to go and look at the literature in the 19th century, I love Thomas Haskell's work on the abolitionist movement and looking at the extent to which changing market relations led to new kinds of moral imaginaries and new sense of negative and positive duties. And again, he uses that experience to begin to hypothesize about what might happen in a current age of globalization. But again, economic drivers coming from the West. Mark Duffield's classic statement on borderlands, which again I see as very much oriented and located in the West. And then there's technological change. And as we know, basically the West gets to claim all technological developments. And so the takeaway line then is that as we narrate the history of humanitarianism, it is a history that is narrated from the standpoint of the West. And that may be empirically accurate. I have reason to believe that, in fact, that's not necessarily off base. But it does say that we need to locate humanitarianism within a kind of cultural moment and not necessarily presume the ideology of humanitarianism that it is by definition universal. These developments have led to something that Didier Fassin, I think, is very, very instructively called the rise of humanitarian governance. And here, drawing from a variety of scholars, he argues that what we now have is the administration of human collectivities in the name of a higher moral purpose that sees the preservation of life and the alleviation of suffering as the highest value of action. So there's an organization that's taking place now, not always centralized, oftentimes decentralized, that is organized around the attempt to improve the human condition. And we have a set of interventions that we can see that have been very much on the move since the late 18th century that are very much interventions that are designed to alleviate suffering and improve that human condition. Through that, though, and this is, I think, is part of that governance structure, is that there has been a centralization, and this is important, a centralization of humanitarian governance. As a political scientist, I will just simply say that even though we like to talk about network governance and things like that, which my European friends love to talk about, network governance, I have to say that as of a realist of sorts, I always think governance is always top-down. And it's very rarely networked and pluralistic as the way it's oftentimes presented, and especially by those in the humanitarian club. But it is very much a centralized top-down hierarchy, and it's centralized in the following ways. It's centralized in terms of the meaning. There is a very clear fixed meaning of humanitarianism, and we can see what happens when people begin to try and relax some of the assumptions. There's a move, a quick reaction, a quick response to try and reinstitutionalize what are seen as those principles of humanitarianism. We see this in the bureaucratization and professionalization. Care has become rationalized. There has been, I think, an important development, and humanitarianism is just the last to catch up with modernity, an important development in which we no longer rely on volunteers, we now rely on experts for the work. Experts, technocracy, those are not democrats. As we know, in terms of the tensions between technocracy and democracy, those kinds of organizing principles run against each other. And oftentimes, as we see, technocracy wins. I think there are lots of reasons why technocracy will win in the case of humanitarianism. In terms of the architecture, it is a hierarchy. At least my reading of the reform process is that every time there's a reform, it basically is designed to leave more power, more decision-making authority in the hands of the top, to the neglect of those at the bottom. And a final factor is that there's been a shift from the private to the public. And by that I mean where decisions are made and who funds. And that's something that's been a century-long process. So in all those elements, what we find is that the humanitarian governance structure has become, I would say, increasingly centralized. Power is organized from the top, from the center, and emanates outwards. And it doesn't mean it's a complete conquest, but it does mean that these are, in my judgment, the organizing principles of humanitarian governance. As I've written recently, and this is the shameless book plug, Empire of Humanity, as I wrote, though, there are tensions within humanitarianism. It's not simply an empire. It is, as I see it, an empire of humanity in which there are countervailing discursive forces that will always, I think, open up space for those whose views and voices are not automatically registered, in part because of the power of the notion of humanitarianism and its emancipatory spirit. It does, though, I think, raise this issue about what happens to humanitarianism as it becomes globalized and internationalized. Because, mind you, that characterization is one that very much rests on a first phase of the globalization of humanitarianism that was very Western-centric and led to a tremendous amount of centralization. In the second movement, though, at least for those who follow debates on global governance, this looks really familiar in the sense that what we're finding is a growing pluralization of actors that are involved. One of the key, I think, interesting developments, of course, in the humanitarian system is the rise of new kinds of actors, whether it's geeks beyond borders in terms of social technology, or whether it's faith-based organizations, or the private sector. We're seeing an expansion of the number of actors that are involved. For those, at least from the perspective of the Humanitarian Club, this is problematic because you now have something that's classic within the globalization literature. You have a fragmentation of authority in which there are different authorities that are emerging, and corresponding to that, you also then have something of a crisis of legitimacy. And when, again, going back to my observations of the meetings that I've attended over the last several years on the future of humanitarianism, those are all on the register. That question of the pluralization that's taking place, the fragmentation of authority, and the problem of legitimacy. So there's an irony here. The more humanitarianism globalizes, the more it looks more like the universal project that it claims to be, the more anxious, it seems, the members of the Humanitarian Club become. So humanitarianism, then, that presents itself as universal is challenged by its own universalization. This anxiety, you can see, comes in two different measures. One is technical. And here I don't have to rehearse something that's all fairly well known to you, that the new actors don't understand the salience of the rules, whether they're sphere standards or something else, that we've now gotten to the point where we know that humanitarianism is too important to be left to amateurs, and so we need professionals to do this. And as a consequence then, what we need to make sure is people are trained well, and these standards are by themselves not subjective but objective. And so there is that technical, but I want to just simply observe that underneath that technical is fundamentally a political question, which is, can the new members, if they choose to be members, which I think is an important question, will they adhere to the rules of the club? Rules not simply being a narrow technical sense, but will they share the same values? And I think that's a legitimate concern. And again, I think what it does is it speaks to the fact that humanitarianism was never as assuredly universal as it claimed to be. So let me now raise, I think are just, as by way of conclusion, as just a set of questions, speculations, that I think are worth thinking about if, in fact, we are now entering this new phase of humanitarianism. First question, what does it mean to say that humanitarianism is universal? That has to be put back on the table. There may be a set of minimal understandings that have to do with an ethic to relieve unnecessary suffering, and it could be the sense that empirically, as you look at, and this is the kind of cultural stock-taking that you see oftentimes, especially within the human rights field, if you look around the world, what we can see is that there are certain minimal standards that all cultures and all groups want to adhere to, and those become, in fact, something that we can build upon. But the overall issue then becomes not only what's universal about humanitarianism, but how do we know its universality? On what grounds? Are we going to continue to coronate it as universal, or is this something that is once again going to be subject to human negotiation? If we unpack humanitarianism, this is the second point, what elements are universal? Could it very well be that the values themselves are not universal, but the technical standards are? Where could those grounds be for general consensus? Third, do members of humanitarianism share the same belief regarding their relationship to politics? Or in a different voice, do they share the same conception of the sacred and the profane? Again, using the kind of religious allegories. And here I was struck, last year I was attending a meeting of NGOs in Cambodia, and of regional NGOs. And one of the things that did not seem to strike them as problematic was a growing role for the private sector into becoming for-profit. They thought that was incredibly consistent with being humanitarian. And I was just simply struck by the nonchalance by which they accepted that, with the kind of horror and dread that my friends in the humanitarian sector feel when told that, in fact, there may be the privatization and the growing role of corporate actors within the humanitarian sector, which suggests that they actually have very different standards about what is the profane, what they worry about, what they see as a threat to the integrity of humanitarianism. These three questions point, then, directly towards that broader issue of, can humanitarianism maintain its legitimacy in a world of diversity? On what basis? Again, these are very familiar questions for those of us who work in the area of international ethics and in areas of global governance. But in fact, they are questions that I think those in the humanitarian sector are going to be asked to address with greater frequency over the next several years. What happens to humanitarian governance in this new age? And I just want to offer several different hypotheses. One has to do with what's the response of the humanitarian club to this new age of globalization? What will be its institutional response? Will they try to create new kinds of governance structures that are more inclusive, more decentralized, or will they alternatively respond to what potentially could be a new threat to their authority by, in fact, centralizing even more? Will they be, then, the Republicans of 2012? Not to put too fine a point on it. From the empirical to the normative, what kind of governance system is fitting for this internationalized humanitarianism? And again, as someone who actually teaches in the area of global governance, one of the things that's always struck me about the humanitarian sector is the extent to which there's really a lack of self-consciousness about the different kind of governance models that are out there and how they can be adapted and jerry-rigged for different kinds of settings. That instead what you have is a humanitarian governance that I think is actually on autopilot and moves in the same way. It's hard to look at the reform process at the UN and see any kind of major change. And it's hard for me to imagine that the UN would respond to some of these developments in a way that would shape it and move it off course from a standard the UN is best. Are these forces that we've talked about that are encouraging decentralization, could they may also contain elements that encourage new actors to comply with the existing rules of the club? Here I just simply, if you go back to the period of decolonization, one of the great fears in decolonization from the colonial powers was that with decolonization, you would have new actors who not only did not understand the rules of the club, but would resist it. And the big surprise, of course, was that the new members, the decolonized states, accepted the rules of sovereignty. In fact, they seemed to be more cherishing of sovereignty in many cases than some of the European countries would be. And so here my question is, as we think about this globalization, are there reasons underlying different sets of predictions that suggest that the new members will, in fact, become socialized into the system, or will they choose to simply play on their own? One of the questions that and this came up quite a bit in this meeting I went to in Cambodia, is what's the incentive for the new actors to play along? And what was interesting was that the answer was there really wasn't much except for legitimacy. They want to be part of the club just for status markers and so they can have conversations with others. But by and large, that was the primary driver, was status. It wasn't anything else. Well, that may suggest then that what you may be seeing is then a governance structure that's not so centralized, but microclimates of governance structures, in which increasingly you have a UN that's unto itself, and then you have regional systems that are emerging, much like we saw in terms of the global economy, regional systems that emerge that are themselves, I wasn't sure if that was a Motown move or okay, but that's to finish up, okay.
You got a message anyway.
I got a message, okay, from on high. And if it is becoming regionalized, will this diversity improve the effectiveness of the humanitarian system? One of those constant concerns, of course, is that the humanitarian system is not effective. Could there be a relationship, a correlation between that lack of effectiveness and its centralization? And then the last is, will the universalization change the way the West understands itself? One of the things that strikes me about humanitarianism and humanitarian governance is that it's not only about creating a better world, it's also about proving to the West its own moral worth. Humanitarianism was not only about interjecting or restoring the humanity of others, it was also about establishing and restoring, and I will just simply say, our humanity. By the process of helping others, we are able to claim that we are actually superior and compassionate human beings. Yet, in this way, following the work of Ilana Feldman and Miriam Tickton, humanitarians are those whose own humanity is dependent on creating, protecting, and restoring someone else's humanity. which I think is a very powerful point. And if that's the case, if regulating humanity is about creating our own humanity, then what happens when the West is no longer able to regulate and create the humanity of others? What happens to the Western identity, which in many ways was so dependent on a sense of compassion and cultural superiority? I appreciate your patience. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. That's the first time anyone's accused me of doing Motown moves. We've got about 10 minutes maximum for Q&A. Bertrand said that we'll schedule lunch from 1 o'clock onwards, and we'll start the afternoon sessions, therefore, at what time? At 2 p.m. will be the start of the afternoon sessions. Yeah. Just very briefly, I'm sure there'll be lots of questions from the floor. This conference is called Humanitarianism, Past, Present and Future. And, speaking as a historian, I'm really delighted that what I get out of, part of what I get out of both these presentations is a sense that the questions that we're interested in, they do have a history. They have a history, right? And that history is multiple and contested. So a lot of the things that seem to be coming out of the presentations by some of the other plenary speakers address precisely that fact that we have to acknowledge different streams, different tendencies, different arguments around humanitarianism. They don't suddenly emerge in the early new millennium, but they have a genealogy, they have antecedents as well. And I also thought that, put on my historian's hat, that to give some sense of the background and the momentous changes that form part of the backdrop to what Thea and Michael were talking about, look no further than the marvellous 4 central works of Eric Hobsbawm, who died recently. To get a sense of the claims of civilization ideologists in the 19th century, the claims of revolutionaries. I mean, one of the words that hasn't come up much in the debate so far is the idea of revolution. Revolution of 1917 or revolution of 1949 as moments of, for many people, of opportunity, of aspiration, of reducing inequality. We don't need to lose sight of those either. Anyway, maximum of 10 minutes. Can I invite questions, comments from the floor? Whose hands up first, please? Thank you.
Well, so sorry. Carolyn Reeves from Harvard University. I am very excited to hear both these presentations. I wish they were flipped because I think Thea's very much gives a next step for Michael's comments. I'm very interested in asking really both of you, but particularly Michael, in the idea of the smashing of the club. Where does China fit into this equation? If we look at global governance, we have to look at China, and we have to look at an alternate civilizational center with its own kind of imperatives. Where do you see China fitting in practically, ideologically, etc.?
Okay. Can I take any other comments and questions? Yeah. So two at the back. Sure. Yeah. Oliver first.
Easy. Sorry.
Thanks. Thanks for 2 absolutely fascinating talks, which I felt, well, obviously teach us a lot, but also there's a very slight tension between them. One is that there is a kind of local expectation of humanitarianism and how it would be constructed in locally resonant and contextual ways, and how that fits with the international system. Which is what I got from the first paper to some degree, a kind of hidden subtext. Maybe that's just my own bias, I don't know. And then the second paper was more that humanitarianism is really about what the West thinks of itself and how it engages with the world. Again, I'm kind of coding for simplification. I wonder how we would think about humanitarianism from the perspective of the global South. Let's forget about the institutions. Let's forget about the policies, strategic interests, and our historical baggage. If we could do a kind of veil of ignorance experiment, how would it be reconstructed from the perspective of the local, from the southern, from the subject perspective? And I wonder whether that would help us.
Yeah. Yes, so John Borton, ODI. This notion of governance, I'm not sure I have a sense of humanitarian governance. And yes, there's the IASC, the Interagency Standing Committee, but what else is there? Who is going to make these decisions? Where are these decisions going to be made about whether it decentralizes or it centralizes? My sense of a lack of governance in the system is, I mean, perhaps it's a bit facile, but I've spoken to a few people here about it. I was really struck 18 months ago when the Linda Polman book came out, how no one, as far as I'm aware, no one really stood up from within the system to defend the system. So there was something about everyone ducking and keeping their heads down and not defending what we are part of. So that leads me to question the notion of governance and how strong it is. And if it's as weak as I think it is, then how are we going to accept where are these decisions, these reactions going to be made? Is it just an atomized process?
With apologies to anyone who had other questions, I can get a response, and I think it's time to break for lunch. So I'm going to ask Thea to speak first, and then Mike, if that's okay.
I will not say much about China. I will leave that to Michael, if you don't mind. And that is also because, honestly, my work doesn't tell you anything about China, because I really always try to see what's happening on the ground and how can we understand how different actors make up those realities there in case studies. So, whatever I can say about China is just as irrelevant as, I don't know, anybody else. So, the humanitarian, the Southern expectations, I find it interesting, and what I've been often very, very puzzled by is that, I find it very understandable, is that many people I know from the South that are working in crisis, they will never ever label themselves as humanitarian, because simply they don't find that label radical enough for what they are doing, because they want change. They want social change, they want real change, they want to do things. But in practice, what they are doing is just as much as other humanitarians try to relieve suffering and try to work towards the reduction of vulnerability for people. So what they do can easily be understood in the framework of humanitarian language, but themselves, they will not easily label themselves, I'm a humanitarian. But there is nonetheless quite a lot of affinity in the way of working, I think. The question about governance, I just share your frustration, John, that there is not much speaking for humanitarianism in a way in response to the attacks that were made, for example, by Linda Polman. And of course, as she's also Dutch, I encounter a lot of it because we seem to be sitting together in all sort of Dutch arrangements. And I agree. And I think the Red Cross movement, which is a movement, and somewhere in the 1970s somehow lost quite a bit of significance in terms of governance, because the coordination became so firmly located within the United Nations. And that's where I would expect some kind of response to what is happening, more than anywhere else.
Lunch away, so I really will be brief. I'm looking for Miwa, because I don't know anything about China. And so I'm the benefit of, yeah, oh no, okay. But you completely punted the China question, so I will use China as something to sort of raise a couple of I think, broader issues. I think one is with the role of China and also with the new donors. There's this question of will they use humanitarian aid and various kinds of assistance in the same kind of instrumentalized ways that we've seen the West do it. And I don't think there's any reason to believe that they won't use the aid in the same way if they choose to become part of the club. It may be that they're also much less universal in terms of the kind of the breadth of the kind of access. I think there's another issue, though, about China, which I would include with India and some of the other emerging powers, is that, in fact, there's less of a need for outside humanitarians to do the work. That, in fact, there is, I think, greater internal capacity. And in cases of India, where there's resistance to having outsiders come in at all. And I think that's becoming a greater phenomenon where you're beginning to see, I think, more regulation from host states to the role of humanitarian actors as they're coming in from the outside, which is a reasonably new development, which I think actually suggests that, again, another set of challenges that lie down the road. And just on John's point, part of me wants to say, yes, you're right, I'm completely wrong that when I talk about governance in a strong sense, it's completely misleading because we have the Linda Pullman book, but we also know that that there's an element in which there's a degree of anarchy, and that while there are a set of rules that are in place, everybody feels very free to ignore the rules when they get on the ground. And so if the rules are completely irrelevant to what people do, then you have to say what kind of, what good are the rules and what kind of governance structure we have. I would simply, though, say in response that what you see, I think, is a weekly organized governance structure that keeps moving and pushing in that direction. Every single reform we see actually moves very much towards greater centralization, wanting more rules. The problem is that, unlike a lot of governance structures, this is a self-regulating governance structure. That if it was actually I think what you'd see is a much more robust governance structure if the nightmare for aid agencies occurred, which was that donor countries came in and said, we are now going to enforce a set of rules. And I don't think that's actually trivial, especially when you see the role of donor agencies and what they're able to do on reporting requirements and everything else. It does have, I think, a subtle way of shaping in very decisive patterns what it is that agencies do on the ground. And so those may be more important to a governance system than, in fact, all the kind of voluntary umbrella organizations that you note.
Got to wrap up there. Can I just remind people that parallel to lunch, there's a poster session downstairs on health and humanitarianism with some poster presentations by PhD students. But can I also say that sessions reconvene at 2 p.m. and go until 3:15 this afternoon. And lastly, can you thank the two speakers? Very good.